Hi, I'm Ganesh, and in this video, we're going to talk about the Program.cs class file in ASP.NET Core. The Program.cs class file contains the code that will execute when our application starts up. So it contains our application startup code. Inside this file, we see a set of statements being defined in the source code file without being contained in a class and method. These statements are called top-level statements, and the feature was introduced in C#9. So with this feature, when we write our statements directly in the source code file without putting them in a class and method, the compiler automatically creates a program class with an entry point method and puts these statements inside that method. On the first line, we are calling WebApplication.CreateBuilder. So the createBuilder method is a static method on the WebApplication class which creates and returns an instance of WebApplicationBuilder. Now, ASP.NET Core supports built-in dependency injection, so services can be added to the dependency injection container and then they are made available throughout an entire application. The WebApplicationBuilder contains services such as configuration and logging, and if we want to add any other services, we can use the services property on the builder object. Let's say we have an interface called iService and a class that implements that interface called myService, and we have a consuming class that specifies iService as a dependency in its constructor. It uses constructor injection, and the consuming class does not have a direct dependency on the myService class implementation. Still, when the consumer is instantiated, an implementation of iService needs to be provided to the constructor. For this, we can take advantage of ASP.NET Core's built-in dependency injection by registering the service in the dependency injection container like so. So you're essentially telling the dependency injection container, when you see an iService type, supply an instance of myService. Now, the ASP.NET Core empty project template by default supports building minimal APIs. If you also want to build Web API with controllers, then we need to add the required services for it. Similarly, to support building Blazor web applications, we need to say builder.services.add components. Next, we are calling build on the Web Application Builder instance, which will return an instance of web application. This is known as the host. The host contains all of the application's resources such as dependency injection services, middleware components, and HTTP server such as Kestrel. After creating an instance of web application, we can configure the request processing pipeline by defining a series of middleware components. A middleware component receives an incoming request, performs operations on it, and either passes the request to the next middleware component in the pipeline or handles the request itself to produce a response. For example, we can say app.useAuthentication and app.useAuthorization and so on. Now, at the start of the middleware pipeline, a middleware component called the EndpointRouting middleware is automatically added, and at the end of the middleware pipeline, a component called the endpoint middleware is automatically added. Next, in this line of code, we are registering an endpoint. This means that when a GET request is sent to the root of the application, then this block of code should execute. Now, what is the URL of our application? If we expand the properties folder in Solution Explorer and open the launchSettings.json file, we see two profiles here, HTTP and HTTPS. We see at the top by default HTTPS is selected. So the settings in this profile will be used when our application is launched. One of the settings is the application URL setting, which specifies the URLs at which our application will be hosted. Now, when this project was created, the option shown here was selected. This option is new in ASP.NET Core 10.0. It configures the project to use the .dev.localhost domain name suffix combined with the project name so that our application could be addressed at this URL. Going back to the program class, if we want to support other types of applications like Web API with controllers, we can register those endpoints as well. for example by calling app.map controllers. Finally, we are calling run method on the web application instance, which starts our Kestrel web server, making it listen for incoming HTTP requests. So our application is now up and running. Now, once again, if we go to the launchSettings.json file, we have the launchBrowser setting in the HTTPS profile set to true. So if we run our application, a browser will be automatically launched and it will send a GET request to the application URL we just saw. The request reaches the Kestrel web server, and the Kestrel web server creates an HTTP context object which it passes to the middleware pipeline. On our middleware pipeline, we saw we had two middleware components registered by default, the EndpointRouting middleware and the Endpoint middleware. The EndpointRouting middleware will take a look at the context object and see that the request is a GET request to the root of the application. And it goes through the list of registered endpoints. In our application, we have just a single endpoint, and the endpoint matches the incoming request. So that endpoint gets attached to the context object, which means the endpoint is now selected. After the endpoint routing middleware, the request reaches the endpoint middleware. The purpose of the endpoint middleware is to simply execute the block of code associated with that endpoint. So it produces the hello world response, which travels back through the middleware pipeline, visiting each middleware component in the reverse order, and then to the Kestrel web server. The server then sends an HTTP response back to the client. And once the response reaches the client, our browser displays the hello world response. By the way, if you're interested in learning about dependency injection in C#, I'm creating a series of videos on it. You can check out the playlist that's on screen right now.